This is Brent Raynes for Alternate Perceptions Online Magazine, and it is Monday, the evening of June the 6th. Just last night, I was talking with the guest who's on tonight with me, Jeffrey Mishlove, Ph.D., who is the author of The Roots of Consciousness and The PK Man, which is what we were primarily talking about last night. Tonight, I think we're going to get into Uri Geller and that situation, which Jeff had some major involvement with, and probably maybe a few other things too, perhaps. But anyway, he's the recipient of the only doctoral diploma in parapsychology ever awarded by an accredited university, in this case, the University of California, Berkeley, in 1980. And between 1986 and 2002, he hosted and co-produced the original Thinking Aloud public television series. Jeff is the award. Is the award prize winner. Can't even read my own writing here. 2021 Bigelow Institute essay competition regarding the best evidence for survival of human consciousness after physical bodily death. Jeff, welcome to Alternate Perceptions.
Thank you, Brent. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Ted Owens was an extremely fascinating subject. You wrote a book on that. We talked about that last night. We may get into it a little later, but toward the end of our discussion, you mentioned your considerable involvement with Uri Geller. And I knew, of course, about Dr. Piharch. I read Uri, the book that he wrote, and how he brought Uri Geller to the United States. But you were really deeply involved with that process, right?
Well, it all started in around 1973. As I mentioned to you, I was a graduate student at Berkeley, and I just started my parapsychology program. I was doing interviews on KPFA radio, and I began sponsoring some symposia on campus, big symposiums in Zellerbach Auditorium. It held nearly 2,000 people. I did one on the frontiers of consciousness. I think it would have been about November of 73. And one of the speakers that I brought in at that time was Andrea Puharich. I had known about his work in Brazil, working with the psychic surgeon there named Arrigo. There was a book published by John Fuller called The Surgeon with the Rusty Knife about Puharich's work with Arrigo. And I figured he'll talk about that, but he made a stunning announcement at that symposium about the work he had been doing in Israel with an Israeli psychic named Uri Geller. This was the first public mention of any of the work with Uri Geller, and it was covered by the San Francisco Chronicle. They did a big story at the time, and so knowing that Geller was already in the San Francisco Bay Area and was being researched at SRI International, as I recall, I invited him to do a public demonstration at the same Zellerbach Auditorium, and we packed the house. People were standing outside by the hundreds who weren't even able to get tickets. It was a big event. It was Uri's first major public appearance in the United States. It was videotaped by one of the local TV channels, and we also sponsored some private events with Uri back then. We're talking February, as I recall, 1974.
All right. Well, I've read about Uri and his visit to SRI and how he really impressed the scientists, and even a formerly skeptical gentleman from the CIA who was supposed to kind of watch things, kind of be a handler and monitor and so on of what went on, and Uri Geller soon impressed him, and his, of course, name was Christopher Kit Green. And now I gathered from what we talked about last night that you had actually witnessed things in Geller's um, various repertoire of experience abilities, like psychokinesis and so on. Uh, that
Yeah, there were many occasions on which I witnessed rings, forks, spoons being bent. One of the most interesting things that Uri did on occasion, more certainly many times, he would ask somebody, "Give me a bean sprout, a mung bean or some other type of bean sprout." He'd hold it in his hand, and you could watch that bean sprout right in front of your eyes, as if time was being accelerated right in the palm of his hand. And
wow.
on one occasion, I had a good friend, Brent, Saul Paul Sirag, who was a physicist and a writer, and he was with Uri in New York, and he wanted to see surprise Uri. He gave Uri a bean sprout rather than a bean, and he told Uri, make the time run backwards. And Uri closed his hand over the bean sprout, and when he opened it up, it was a whole bean instead of a sprout.
Wow, something he was unprepared to do.
Completely unprepared for. Yep.
I know that years ago, I walked. I was in New York City, and I walked into the office of Harry Barlisle, who at that time had a newsstand publication, two of them, in fact, UFO Update, and another one, Strange. I think it was Strange Dimensions. Anyway, it was on the paranormal, anything under the broad umbrella of the paranormal. And he was telling me that one day Uri Geller showed up at his office, and he said it was like pins popping off a bulletin board, and something on his desk had moved. And he said there was no way this was trickery. He said that he had never been in his office before, and just his presence, all of a sudden, this kind of psychokinetic activity began to erupt. And I I was always fascinated by too the story that there have been different authors who have documented this, but when Uri Geller was working at the Livermore Nuclear Laboratory, about 30 miles from SRI, and they were, I think this was 1974, and they were studying his abilities. And some of the scientists that worked there became very spooked because they began seeing things. Um, one, I think one scientist at home, and maybe his wife too, had seen like these tall, dark, bird-like figures walking around the yard. And there was a husband and wife seeing at the foot of their bed like an arm with a hook on the end of it, just sort of hovering in the air. And then there was like a light, small orb or something that had been seen by scientists. And by the time that Kit Green got there and interviewed him, there were two of them that were threatening to leave because they were genuinely spooked and on the verge of, you know, crying about it. I think they were quite frightened. And I had heard from a gentleman that I had met in Ohio back in 1975 named Earl Neff, and he was a ufologist who was who was actually the creator of a group called the Cleveland Ufology Project, or CUP, back in the 1950s. And I had written him about 4 years earlier, and he was very skeptical of these stories. The only contact stories he really placed any credibility at the time was Betty and Barney Hill. But Dr. Schwartz, Dr. Berthold Schwartz, who you know, uh, had suggested when I was traveling about in 1975 that I look, you know, Earl Neff up. And so I finally caught up with him at one of these meetings. And he went, we went into a private room with another gentleman who was sponsoring a COP meeting named Richard Lee, and sat down with my tape recorder, and he began to tell me all these weird paranormal things that were going on. And he would do talks, and people would come up to him afterwards and saying they had seen figures walking around him, humanoid figures, shadow people, or strange orbs of light. And he really took it quite seriously. Even had a photographer sit in the audience and see if he could uh, capture the images. And he said that one day he was approached by this woman after his talk at a Catholic church, and the woman said, "Why do you think it is that nobody has ever, you know, silenced you or anything, or given you any trouble?" And he said that the voice from behind him said, "Maybe we like what he's saying." And he turned around, there was nothing but a blank wall there. And he called another UFO researcher who I'd met named Larry Moyers from Akron, and says, "Larry, take this woman's statement. We just had a very unusual experience." But anyway, the point is he met Uri Geller. He was an amateur magician himself, and he said he had seen Geller, like yourself, do things that couldn't be explained. And kind of similar, it made me think of the Livermore incidents, was with how there was a popular radio announcer in Ohio that told him privately one day that after Uri Geller had been to the station and did a talk, that he and I believe a couple of other staff members were in the radio station, looked out the window, and one of the radio towers was crumbling and collapsing to the ground and like in slow motion. And the fact was, it didn't happen, but they all saw it. It was just a very weird, scary thing at the time. And so I called Uri Geller up to tell him this. He was in England, and I had written to him, and he gave me his number, and I called, and I told him about that incident. And come to find out, he didn't even know anything about it. He said, "That's a major event." And he said, like the Livermore scientists, very credible people. Nobody is hurt, but there's just unexplained, sometimes frightening seeming things that happen around that, I just can't explain. So uh, that kind of, to me, factors into some of the strange things that happen with UFO experiences. They call it psychoid effect or the Oz effect, where um, even the late Swiss psychologist Carl Jung kind of hinted at this in his book on flying saucers, Modern Myth of Things Seen in the Sky, back in the late 50s, actually his last book. And he compared a lot of the phenomena to like archetypal projections of a collective unconscious, but he couldn't really understand, like air pilots chasing these things where they seem very physical and could track them on radar and see them at the same time. But he said he was once at uh, a seance setting with a psychic medium, and there were four other people, and this is described in his book on flying saucers, that couldn't understand why he himself couldn't see this moon-shaped orb that was hovering over the abdomen of a psychic medium. The four of them could see it, but he couldn't. But he said he'd heard of other similar things, and he called it psychoid. And anyway, it just kind of goes to the deeper and more evolving complexity of all the these kind of reports.
Well, Brent, back in the 19th century, at the one of the very first large books produced by the founders of the Society for Psychical Research in England was called Phantasms of the Living, and it was about people who saw apparitions, and the apparitions were of other living people, not ghosts. And what they discovered is what you're reporting here very often. An apparition can be seen by multiple people, but not everybody who was in the same room. So it certainly does appear to have a very strong psychological component to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, and well, I know one of your guests, Nancy Dutartry. I I met her back in August along with Dr. Bob Davis, both people who have been on your show in the past.
Yeah.
And Nancy had an experience that I believe really set her on the UFO path. She wrote the book How to Talk to an Alien back in 2015. And she and her daughter had come out of a movie theater in New Jersey, which was in a very large city, over I think it was like 55,000 people, she said. And it was like they were the only ones there. It was like empty. The theater was empty, the parking lot was empty, and this was a very unusual thing. And then her daughter looks up and sees a large boomerang shaped object in the sky above them. And you've probably heard the story already, but I come across this from time to time. Again, it's just a part of the phenomenon. I know that Dr. Hynek was quoted in his book On the Edge of Reality, that he worked a lot of conversation with Jacques Vallée, and they were talking about apparitions. And Dr. Hynek said that the difference with UFOs is if there's one in the area, everybody sees it if they look up. But that doesn't seem to be the case, really. I just don't think he looked into that. Or John Keel had written about it. He called them subjective sightings, and he even hinted that if you were with someone who was seeing something you couldn't, maybe you might touch their shoulder, or that might enable you to maybe connect, somehow. I've done that once. It didn't work. Darn it. But anyway, it's worth a try.
Well, since we've been talking about Uri Geller, and you mentioned the appearance of bird-like beings that were seen by some of the Livermore scientists. There's a wonderful description of this in my first book, The Roots of Consciousness, published in 1975, when I was very close to Uri Geller and all of this material. I wrote about the hawk as a symbol that had come up in many of the Geller sightings. Puharich wrote about it in his book, Uri, and he talked about being with Uri in Israel and in a big hotel. I think it was called the Sharon Tower. And hawks would fly in off the ocean. He said, come right up to his balcony and stare him in the eye. And he thought that was very strange. And then on one occasion, he was with Uri on a balcony just like that, and a hawk feather fell down right in front of Uri. And Uri looked up to see where it came from. And then he pointed up at the sky and he said, look at that, because Uri was looking at a large dark UFO right over the top of the hotel. And Puharich looked up. I think he was with another companion at the time. They both looked up. They didn't see anything, but they were convinced that Uri saw what he said he saw.
Yeah. And of course, by that time, Puharich had enough experiences and seen enough with Uri to really not question that aspect. But yeah, that's interesting. There's I'm trying not to get off topic, but I don't know if we can. Some years back, I was at the Association for Research and Enlightenment in Virginia Beach, Virginia, at the conference doing a UFO paranormal talk. And I had replicas of a shamanic tool called the Peruvian whistling vessels. And they make a very high-pitched harmonic frequency whistle. And they also, when blown together, others of the whistles kind of suspected of like a binaural beat, like the kind of the Monroe Institute uses to perhaps alter consciousness and do astral things and whatnot. And a lot of people, when they hear these, they have sometimes like a vision or some sort of insight. So Betty Edgerson Luker, a well-known UFO contactee, abductee, was there at the time, and she had this vision. And so anyway, it has a a large large bird behind this large upright
Yeah,
stone, and
and
a
it's a
fire.
hawk with a hooked beak.
Yes, and it's got like a fire at the base of it, and she clearly saw this. She was, quite profoundly affected by it at the time, and we talked about it just before she went up to do her talk, and then later she drew it out and she sent me the original, so I had it framed.
How
But
interesting, and interesting that you should mention the Peruvian whistling pots, and that you apparently had or have a set of replicas. To my knowledge, those replicas were probably made by my friend Daniel Statt, who did the original research on them back in the 1970s, 1980s.
yeah, wow. Yeah, we actually met him. He was passing through. We'd been in correspondence, and um, he would occasionally out near St. Louis. There's a large mound that he said when he was in town there, passing through, he would go up on top and blow the whistles. And so he told him, well, if you're coming through here, there's a place up near Jackson, Tennessee, with a 72-foot tall mound that we think is pretty spectacular, and we could get together there. So we did one day, and he had the ones I've been using are Chimu culture. He has one that was based on the Vicus culture of Peru, and it was a different pitch, a little lower. And so we got to experience that with him. And my wife's been working on pottery, and he worked out where she could get two of his molds to use and some instructions. And so that was pretty awesome. And we've also been in touch with uh, Don Wright of Silver City, New Mexico. Now, he's the one I actually got four whistles from. And then I've actually got some from people in Peru who have been making and selling their replicas. So anyway, it's been a real interesting journey.
Well, we have this in common. I have a set of six.
Oh, okay, yeah. So there, yours came from Daniel himself.
Yeah.
All righty. Yeah, we in fact may find this interesting. Doctor I wrote the book DMT, the Spirit Molecule.
Rick
Uh,
Strassman.
yes, yes. I did an interview with him back in, I think, 2002, right after his book had come out, and there was the aspect of the similarity of the effects of people under the DMT. That there was about 60 for over a 5-year period who he had given these doses to of DMT, and they would describe things that he didn't expect to be described. There was even kind of UFO type abduction type things, and so I interviewed him, and then I was reading the book, and it was something about the vibrations, sound vibrations from the whistles. Maybe he thought maybe our vocalizations could vibrate the pineal gland or something, and perhaps create some kind of chemical reaction. So I asked him about the Peruvian whistles, and he said, "Yeah, they're very psychedelic. I had a gentleman come by here one time and demonstrated them for me." And I said, "Oh, really? Who was it?" And he says, "I can't really remember." So I says, "Well, was it, by the way, Don Wright?" That's the guy. Yeah, in fact, he said he was one of the subjects of my experiment, with the DMT. And so I got in touch with Don, and I says, "Can you write an article about your experience for us?" And he did. And it was just an interesting series of coincidences or synchronicities, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, we could go off on miles and miles on that subject.
Well, Brent, you've been around a long time, and I guess I have too. So we both have undoubtedly interacted with many of the same people.
Yeah, it's people have said, "Oh man, you've got a lot of material," and I said, "Well, I've been at this for 55 years, and reaching out to people in that length of time, you can't help but, make a lot of connections. Especially, of course, with me, I blame John Keel for, opening my mind to all these different alternative areas that I know people in the field who have been in it longer than I have, the UFO field, and some of them still don't really open that door yet. They're still just strictly nuts and bolts ET. But once you open that door, there's just a lot of ground to cover. And and at that 2005 ARE event, I met Jacques Vallée, the one and only time I've met him, but I was able to do an interview with him afterwards, and I was quite fascinated to learn that he was called in on a confidential basis to study remote viewers, because they had a lot of them who were describing, like Uri Geller and Ingo Sworn, UFO experiences, I think going back to childhood. So anyway, he even made the comparison when he got up and talked about how Edgar Casey was a very spiritual person and had gifts that, came to him from an encounter with a kind of a woman type figure inside of a globe of light when he was a young man, I think about 13, and asked what he wanted to do in his life. And he wanted to help people. And that's set him on this path as a psychic reader and all. So, believing that he was glimpsing into people's Akashic record their backgrounds, the Akashic records. And I think there's like over 12,000 readings that he gave that are still stored at the, ARE, Association for Research and Enlightenment there in Virginia. And so there's lots of dots to connect here.
Yeah.
But let's see. Did you ever happen to meet Christopher Kit Green yourself in your?
Well, as a matter of fact, I met him for the first time recently because he was one of the judges of the Bigelow Institute essay competition. So they awarded the prizes on December 4th, 2021. That happens to have been my 75th birthday, and that's when I met Kit Green.
Oh, wow. Well, yeah, there was, I know that I had heard back in November 2018 that he and another researcher from Stanford, Gary Nolan, were doing research into contact experiences, two of who I think were with the SRI, remote viewers. I suspect one was probably Uri Geller, but I don't know for sure. But they were doing MRIs of people's brains and finding that there seemed to be some wiring there that was a little different with the people who claimed they had seen like a UFO, close encounter, hit by a beam of light, or that sort of thing. And comparing it to a regular cross section of people who claimed they hadn't had such experiences. So I hope that down the road that Gary Nolan had written me that they were going to eventually do a peer review journal article on their findings, but it was still premature at the time that we corresponded briefly. But it sounds quite fascinating. And I've also heard that the corpus callosum that connects the right and left hemisphere of the brain also seems to be a little larger in people who do meditation and maybe have psychic experiences that supposedly Edgar Casey and Albert Einstein had larger corpus callosum. Of course, Albert Einstein used to use a practice where he kind of visualized things and would come up with concepts based on what he kind of visualized.
Well, my friend Jean Millay, she is now deceased, but she was both a parapsychology researcher, a gifted visual artist, and a medium who would go into trance and channel. And one of the focuses of her own doctoral dissertation, as I recall, was that extrasensory perception is facilitated when you can develop a coherent synchronization between the two hemispheres of the brain
Mm.
so that they're in balance. And naturally, that the corpus callosum, being the tissue that connects the two hemispheres, would be crucial for that.
Yeah, yeah. I had come across some back in let's see, I'm going back a few years, 2009 or yeah, I think it was 2009. I just happened to come across two cases where I interviewed these separate. Uh, one case was New York, the other one was uh, happened in Nevada, but both people were in Tennessee when I interviewed them, and they were recalling these different experiences they had, and each one described encountering a humanoid figure, uh, presumably an alien, and in each one they were holding the being would hold a a globe in its left hand, and it would rise up and could operate sort of like a little drone. And I thought, wow, each time they were talking, these two different people, they would hold up the hand, demonstrating, what happened. I says, was that the hand? Yeah, and of course I'm thinking brain hemisphere, brain hemisphere. So I started looking it up, and I found three other reports in the literature, but no one was really talking about it, in different countries where there was a globe in the left hand. So when I was working with Uri Hernandez and others for the free organization, the Foundation for Research and Extraterrestrial Extraordinary Experiences, and they were doing the survey of experiences, I talked to Ray Hernandez about, doing a survey on the instruments they used. And I was, hoping to find something like that in there. There were some interesting things. We had over 100 responses uh, in the questionnaire that I helped to create with Ray, but none of them really went into what I was looking for. But uh, which is kind of frustrating. I also came across um, a number of people describing hearing a voice in their left ear, and in one of those, it was a woman down in Florida who had had a close encounter with her family, her husband and 13-year-old son, disc-shaped object near a naval base, and and about 2 or 3 days later, the home erupts with poltergeist activity, and she kept hearing a voice calling her name out of her left ear.
Mm.
And then one of the more spectacular examples of that was Anthony Peake wrote in one of his books, a British researcher, writes a lot on consciousness and psychic phenomena and quantum physics. And he wrote about a man who, for a number of years, was hearing an inner voice that he tried to ignore, but one day it warned him about getting on a plane going over to somewhere, I think in Africa, and told him something bad was going to happen. And it kept on, and he finally heeded the message, and there was uh, where he would have been. I think there was an earthquake and a tsunami. So, he began to pay more attention. And this went on for quite a number of years, him hearing this voice, and said it was always his left ear. And I remember there was also another example of a psychic medium in England, and the voices were always communicating him out of his left ear. So I began to wonder about that connection. So anyway, there's something about the way we're wired. I think one day someone's going to nail that down, maybe. But anyway.
Yeah, I don't really know if I can add much to that discussion. I'm not too familiar with the workings of the brain, but I am very familiar with the work of Bernardo Kastrup, who is one of the leading philosophers these days, a proponent of philosophical idealism. And he has something
Oh,
very interesting to say about the brain, which I think your viewers might appreciate. He said, mostly the conventional viewpoint is that consciousness is produced by the brain. And he said, actually, from the point of view of philosophical idealism, the brain is produced by consciousness.
yeah. Uh, the whole mind brain thing there. The brain helps us maybe processing things we need to do here, but then there's another part that's non-local reality or what, um, we get into parapsychology, quantum physics. Um, I don't know. It's um, there's a lot I don't know about the brain either, but I'm curious. I think somehow all these things connect with consciousness and the physics, and a lot of times in ufology, I think the only thing that in the past that the uh, psychologists and neuroscientists and people, therapists were questioned about by the researchers was their subject reporting something. Were they sane or not? Once they were saying, okay, we have a good UFO reporter here, but they didn't deal with generally with the larger questions and elements, the psychic components of these things that crop up if you look for them.
Well, the very existence of consciousness is sort of a paradox, because if you're a materialist and you say that, the world is composed of ping pong ball like particles, or billiard ball like particles, atoms and subatomic particles all bouncing around, nobody has yet figured out, even in theory, how consciousness can evolve out of a system like that.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. Not just human consciousness, but all the how this mud ball at one time, there was originally just uh, these various elements, very primitive, and out of this emerged all this life that we have, human and other lives, and how all these cells can suddenly come together and do what they do.
Yep.
It's pretty mind-boggling. But
It
anyway,
is, but time seems to have something to do with it. It took billions of years for uh, even to go from the first single-celled organisms up to multi-celled organisms.
yeah, and now look at it. We
Yeah.
got so many different species of life forms, and over 7.5 billion people on the planet now. um,
With the
and
capability for the first time in human history to destroy themselves.
yeah, that's a frightening reality.
Hmm.
Yes. Hopefully we'll all come to our senses and work together.
Well, hopefully, but I imagine in this big universe with so many, probably billions of planets out there, there have been other advanced civilizations of sentient beings who did, in fact, destroy themselves.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's something we'll maybe find out later on as if we evolve far
Yeah.
enough in that direction.
Hmm.
But anyway, well, let's see. I really covered, I think, Berthold Schwartz. We could mention him. he
Yeah.
was he was originally, as I recall, it was back around the time of World War II, and he had a brother over in Germany And both he and his and Bert's mother had a premonition that something happened to him, and then they got news that he had died, and that was when, uh, you know, Bert Schwartz became interested in the paranormal and dived deep into it, really. And then in 1968, he just happened to write an article in a medical journal about 4 people he had interviewed who seemed to be very credible individuals, no abnormal psychopathology or anything, who had described these spectacular UFO experiences. So he wrote it up in this medical journal, and Paul Harvey, a famous newscaster, I think out of Chicago, uh, saw the item and reported it in the news. And John Keel got wind of it and uh, contacted Dr. Schwartz and said, I essentially said that he needed to continue in the paranormal and the UFO field. And so as a result, he did, and he made trips to various places across the country and interviewed experiences. Of course, you know about Stella Lansing in Palmer, Massachusetts, and uh, her repeated experiences and films and things, and other people. He wrote a book in 1983, I think, a 2-volume book, UFO Dynamics, which was over 500 pages. And John Keel had written that he even promoted in a magazine called Fate Magazine that it was one of the better UFO books out there. And yet he complained later that it was hardly made much impression upon the UFO buffery, as he calls them. And essentially, I think it was because despite all the work as a psychiatrist, he did interviewing all these people, that he didn't promote the mainstream nuts and bolts ET theme. It was he focused more on the psychic elements and things. And so anyway, that's the
He also
hazards.
contributed to parapsychology. He wrote a wonderful book on parent-child telepathy.
Yes,
So he was quite interested in the interpersonal dynamics as it affects telepathic contact.
right. He also wrote psychic dynamics too, and some other materials. So anyway, well, once again, I've taken up a bit of your time here, and I know you're a busy man. um, so Jeff, as I guess we should maybe wind this up for now. Is there anything that you'd like to add or mention, that something you have coming up? I would like to, a site you would like people to visit?
Well, we've certainly touched on a lot of topics. I would like to encourage your viewers to check out my YouTube channel, New Thinking Aloud, which is ALLOWED. And if you go to New Thinking Aloud, all one word, .com, you'll get there. And we've, the last 7 years, I've uploaded, I think, close to 1,500 videos covering many aspects of both parapsychology and UFO research.
As a tremendous number of programs you've done. Awesome, really. It's, man. And by the way, I came across your let's see, your article you wrote for Fate Magazine on Ted Owens.
Oh, yeah, well, there you have it. Yes.
You've been everywhere. So anyway, well, thanks so much again, Jeff, for talking with me and sharing your thoughts and experiences and ideas and so on all these intriguing topics.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, Brent. You're a wealth of information yourself. I'm very proud to have an interview with you about John Keel on the New Thinking Aloud channel.
Well, I'm very honored to have been included in the Thinking Aloud family there. So much appreciated. So anyway, well, as I say on Ghost Hunters, on to the next. So you take good care.
You too. Thank you, and bye for now.
All right, we'll see you.